opens with some rather strong rebuke about worldliness and being too, shall we say, attached to the world. James calls it spiritual adultery. And as he's discussing this problem, he then makes some calls, some appeals to us as Christians. James chapter 4, we're going to begin at verse 7 and read 2 verses from James, the 4th chapter, as we consider the idea of needing to just at least be a part of the fight, to not be inactive, but to be actively engaging with Satan. Look at the actions that are given. That's all we're really going to do in this passage for this morning, is just take note. And actually, I have a section on the handout, if you picked it up, after that colon where you can list. I've counted 4 to 5. I even put the last one with a forward dash or forward slash for the 5th one in just these 2 verses alone. And there are a ton of text that have this kind of activity focus to them. This one is just one example that specifically also draws our attention to our conflict with Satan. Let's read it. James 4, 7 and 8. Submit yourselves, therefore, to God, based on his statement about humility and God's grace in verse 6. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Verse 8 now, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. You see that pattern there? That balance. Resist, flee, draw near, draw near. And then the last part of verse 8 says, cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Here are these actions from this text. I even put them on the screen so you can cheat or you can just read the text. If you want to jot those down. He says, submit to God. Be willing to have the humility to lower yourself and allow God to control your life. In this case, especially given our discussion, instead of Satan being allowed to win, being allowed to take your life, you've surrendered your life to God. And then he says simply, resist Satan, and he'll run. Satan here is depicted as not being the bravest character, or even the best fighter in this war. I mean, that's not to say that Satan is weak. I mean, Satan is powerful. But in this context, on the basis of submitting my life to God, saying, God, you control my life, and actually letting God do that through His Word, then when I stand up to Satan, when I say no to the temptation, to the opportunity that Satan brings my way, then Satan leaves. Satan runs away. As the English Standard translates, he flees. You can think of that old image of the dog with his tail between his legs. But that's all James says to do. Now, there are other instructions that get a bit more specific, and we're going to talk about some of those in a minute. But for right here, James just says, you fight. Fight back, and Satan's going to run. And he gives us some other instructions, like get close to God. Draw near to God. This is a reminder to be active in what we sometimes call our devotional life. There's more to it than that, but there is great power against Satan in merely spending a decent amount of time consistently in God's Word. Consistently in prayer. Consistently, it might be that you have a devotional as well or something like that, another tool that you can incorporate. There's a lot of different ways to strengthen and build up my private or family devotional life. But there's also a call to be active in other ways. There are other ways to draw near to God, to submit to God, being involved in the works of God's people by serving people. It is far too easy for us to have that mentality where I want to be served. What is it they call it now? The consumer mentality that's made its way into the church. Where I want to come and people take care of me and everything is laid out for me. But don't you dare ask me to do anything. It's not why I'm here. The call in James 4 is to be actively involved, to be a participant, not someone that is complacently only on the receiving end of service. And then there's attention here to sin. He calls out people and says, "You're sinners and double-minded. Take care of that." It's another way he requests us, appeals to us, tells us, rather really, to be active in how we fight sin and therefore Satan in our lives. That's number one this morning. That's where it all starts, is not being inactive when it comes to Satan, not turning a blind eye and ignoring heart, that it's a real fight, and I've got to step into the center of the ring. The second one this morning, the second way we can let Satan win is by independence. A week from today is our holiday, the 4th of July, the date, the celebration, the declaration of independence from Britain. And we live in a nation, we discussed this some Sunday night, so I'm not going to overlap too much. I know not all of you were here Sunday night anyway, but we realize that we live in a world, a culture that for a couple of centuries or so has built in this idea that says we're free, we're independent. Nobody can tell us what to do. And this is on an individual basis. This is not just as a nation, but as individuals. We're the land of the free, which means I can do whatever I want. Well, that's what we say anyway. I have that liberty. And we really put a lot of emphasis often on being self-sufficient. Although, as a nation, we're probably more dependent physically on other people and other things and the system than we ever have been as individuals, most of us. But as a culture, we've also become more and more isolated, more and more private and withdrawn. This is my life, this is my business. We really like that word, none of your business, or that phrase, that's none of your business. And I wonder if that hasn't filtered its way into our look at spiritual things. If you're counting this morning, if I'm counting, when I say your, I mean me too. If we're counting, let's put it that way, on our just sheer willpower or our own abilities, our own education, even spiritual education, or maybe it's, well, I've gone to church every Sunday for however many years or decades. If we're counting this morning on something like that to help us not lose, to help us win the war against Satan, then we're in trouble. If you're in James chapter 4, go with me now to Ephesians, the 6th chapter, Ephesians chapter 6. As the Apostle Paul writes here by inspiration, begins to wind down his message in this letter, he writes this pretty lengthy picture. And he takes the armor, maybe of a Roman soldier, at least of an ancient soldier, and he holds that up and says, look at this, and uses this now to say to us even today, this is what your spiritual warfare is meant to be like. But look at it. Read verse 10 with me. He says, finally, be strong in... And I left a blank there on the handout because there are, as we just noted, there are a lot of different things we could put in there, aren't there? Be strong in yourself. Be strong in you're a good family. Be strong in... But is that what Paul writes? He says, be strong in the Lord. Read it with me. And in the strength, not of my might, but of His might. And then in verses 11 through 13, it's put on His armor. It doesn't say put your armor on. And we could say that and know what we mean by that. We mean put on the armor He's given us. But just so it's really clear, He doesn't say that. He says, you need to put on this armor of the Lord. Let's read now 11 through 13. It says, put on the whole armor of God. And here's the purpose, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, because this is the kind of battle you've got. You can't go out and work out and get strong to fight this battle. You can't have the right nutrition. You can't find the right weapons. It's not going to work. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God. And then he says it again, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, having taken up this whole armor, to stand firm. He does say we're going to have to be a part of this fight. We're going to have to stand, but I can't do it without His armor. I've got to put on His armor. Quickly, let's read through verse 18 and take note of the pieces of the armor. The first one, he says in verse 14, stand therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness. He says you start with truth and righteousness. The gospel of Jesus is the truth that holds it all together. May we never let go, may we never cease holding on at the core of who we are as Christians to what's made us that, the gospel. And the truth of God, it is not true because it works. Listen, it works, and it does, because it is true. And it's that truth that we are to base our fight, our lives on. And then he says, have this breastplate of righteousness. You've been made right and in the right by Jesus' blood, by the work of Jesus. Know that. But also know then that it's not you. Our righteousness, it's not about us. Because of Jesus. Look at verse 14. He says, verse 15 rather, and as shoes on your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. Or you could translate it as put on the shoes that here are the gospel of peace, so that you're ready for battle. You're that soldier that he's armed up, he's suited up. What is it they say now on the superhero shows? Suit up. Well, the Bible says, put on your suit, get on your shoes, get on your shoes. And it's peace. The gospel has brought peace to your life. We could go back to Ephesians 2 and look at 11 through 13, where he's already written that at one time you didn't have this peace. You were alienated and enemies of God, no hope. But now, verse 17 of Ephesians chapter 2, now Jesus has come and preached, there's that word, peace. To those of you who were far off, now He's come near and preached peace. And that's what's on my feet. Satan, he wants to knock me off my feet. He wants to ruin me and destroy me forever. But to keep me from losing my footing, to give me the stability in life so that I'm not always tossed about, to ground me, is the peace that I have with God and that I can have with you, because Jesus has made peace by the blood of His cross. We have to keep reading. I did say quickly, right? Verse 16 talks about faith. He says, in all circumstances, take up the shield of faith. Someone called it believing loyalty. It's the power to keep on when you don't want to keep on keeping on. With which, he goes on to write, you can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one. There he is again. And consider the whole verse. He starts by describing all circumstances, and at the end, you're receiving attacks from Satan, whether it's despair or temptations, worries, when things fall apart in your life, when every vehicle you own isn't running well, when whatever it is, the bank's closing on the mortgage. He says when Satan is sending the darts, all circumstances, it's the shield of faith. It's going to protect you. You'll still get hit, but it won't make it. Won't be vital. Won't work. And then he writes this, verse 17, and take up the helmet. What does a helmet do? Well, it's supposed to protect your head. So what keeps Satan from getting in our heads? Salvation. I know the ultimate battle, the ultimate war is already done. Jesus has already conquered. Jesus has already defeated Satan. It's just a matter of time until everything else catches up with that reality. And if I know that, I'm saved. I have salvation in Jesus. Satan can't touch my head. And then the last piece of what we could call the armor, it's the only piece that is offensive. So Satan's coming at me, and the way to defend is by being dependent on God's armor. I'm not going at this alone. But then he says, the rest of verse 17, and the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God, which brings us right back to the gospel. Do you see how all of this is dependent on the gospel to fight Satan? And that's 6 of them. I included a 7th in my list from verse 18. It's not really armor. It's like the communication lines to the commander. So there's 7 in total, if you want to think about it that way, that I'm dependent on. Verse 18, praying at all times in the Spirit, with all prayer and supplication. And then he goes on to say, to that end, keep alert with all perseverance, making supplication for all the saints. And then he goes on to include himself and his own ministry in that. I don't know if there's anything that can only happen as it should through faith other than prayer. What is it we're told elsewhere? That we better be careful about praying as somebody that has a double mind, where I'm praying and that prayer says I trust God, but on the inside I'm not trusting God. I don't know if there's anything that will drive us to prayer more than faith, which has already been mentioned. But I also don't know of anything that will grow our faith and our dependence on God than when I come before God, alert and persevering. It's hard work, Paul says, if you're doing it right. And I lay it all at His feet. That says, I'm dependent on the God who made me. And before I fight Satan, before I do anything myself, it's prefaced. It's like the constant preface to my fight with Satan is that I'm taking this battle, this trouble, this temptation, this problem to God. Because I'm not independent. I'm not isolated. The fact you're here this morning is a good sign that you're not isolating yourself from God's people and from gathering in public corporate worship. And doing that has an impact that often is subconscious, but it's there. And then lastly this morning, not only is it by being inactive and by being independent, but it's also by being invincible or by invincibility. There's a bit of a catch-22 here, that when I've got the armor of God, I can be confident that I can fight this battle. But that can get me in trouble. I'm going to give you a couple of passages this morning. One is in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. It's Paul's own example. And I'll let you read that one on your own time. He brings in a couple of other pictures about athletes and actually a boxer. But let's look at the one in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 together this morning as we bring this to a close. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 12 and 13. Here's ancient Israel's example. The first 11 verses are a series of sins and problems that Israel had in the wilderness. And Paul says these were written so that we could learn from them. There are our examples so that we don't make the same mistakes they made. So that we don't do this. So that we don't start to think, well, we're the people of God. We've been immersed into Jesus. We talk about immersion in this chapter. We partake of the communion every Sunday. He compares that in this chapter. We're good to go. But then he writes this in verse 12. We'll read verse 13 too. He says, therefore, let anyone who thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you that is not common to man. God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation, He will also provide the way of escape that you may be able to endure it or to win, to overcome Satan's ploys. But do you see that if you read verse 13, there's dependence, but you could walk away from verse 13 and you say to yourself, I've got this. Satan can't get me. God's going to work even in the temptation. That's how powerful and providential God is. I know I can escape. I'm good to go. But verse 12 says, be careful. That if you think you've got it, you probably don't. It's that if you think it will never happen to you. You ever looked at somebody, a drunk, an alcoholic, a homeless person, someone who has an affair, who commits adultery? On and on the examples could go, and you look at them and you say, that never happened to me. I'd never do that. Not in a million years. You won't catch me doing that. You think it won't happen to you? You think it could not? It likely will. It's when I get this attitude of invulnerability and invincibility that I'm at the most dangerous point. And it could be that I have the inactivity, I'm active. And from one perspective, I'm dependent. I'm reading my Bible, and I'm at church and all of that. Satan can't get me. When he probably already has me. Because I think, but I'm wrong. There is never a day in our lives as Christians when we don't desperately need the grace and forgiveness and blood of Jesus. When I am at my highest spiritual point, that doesn't change. And when I am at my lowest, His grace is still able to reach me. But in neither of those have I somehow moved on. Because as someone said, the greatest weakness spiritually with our fight with Satan is not our actual weaknesses so much as when we don't think we have them. These are some ways that Satan can win. Whether it's by inactivity, we just don't fight. We throw in the towel. Or by independence, or we start getting the idea in our heads that I don't need anybody. I can, and I do. And then as you might have noticed, the last one overlaps with that one in that this invincibility complex. Now, sometimes we struggle with assurance, and I know we sang that song earlier, but sometimes we struggle with a false assurance. Or I think I'm something. Might not be. Now, the opportunity is yours this morning to become a part of this family, to obey the gospel of Jesus, to do what Jesus has done for you, and join in that. What I mean by that is by being buried with Jesus, washed by Jesus' blood, and raised with Jesus. Because it all starts there, and we never leave there. Because it's the gospel that says, I can be victorious. But it's the gospel that says, only if I'm in and I stay with Jesus. That's his name as we stand and sing together.